So in chapter 6, we're basically going to be focusing on this concept of atypical psychological development. So another word for atypical is like abnormal. Okay, it's psychological development that isn't normal, that doesn't follow the normal or typical progression of development. Okay, so before we get into all the content that we're going to do today, which is mainly going to be talking about like the definition of what is normal, what are some different perspectives or approaches to defining a normal thing, basically. I just wanted to remind everybody of the homework. So I've been noticing that in most classes, most of you are doing your homework really well, but some of you are not really handing in your homework on time. And so especially for last week, there's a pretty big number in this class who still are yet to submit work to me. So I've only got about 5 people out of 20 or 22 people in our class who have actually submitted the homework. Okay, so I need to make sure that all of you are submitting the work on time. So what I wanted to show you is basically how we are kind of tracking your homework submission. So on my desktop, I've got a folder that says, learning from home student work. And so all of these folders are kind of like your portfolio of work that you've been doing. So in case your year level coordinator or somebody is going to ask me for, okay, what work has this student done? I would basically be opening up your folder and showing it to them. And if your folder is empty and it's got no work at all, that's going to be a problem, okay? Because it means it's basically showing that you barely gave any kind of dedication to these online classes, okay? So make sure that you are submitting the work through the file Dropbox. If you can't use the file Dropbox or for some reason it's playing up, just email me the work. I don't have any issues with that, okay? But the main thing is I need all of you to submit the work, okay? And if there's work that needs to be submitted, it's not optional, it's compulsory, you have to do it, okay? So that's basically the main thing I wanted to say here. Do your homework so I can fill up your folders and you can have a good portfolio of work for this subject, okay? Alrighty, now, just kind of moving on now to the main topic. So our first slide is basically defining atypical development. So the name of this chapter is The Complexity of Psychological Development. And I'm sorry, atypical psychological development. So when we're talking about atypical development, it's basically development that doesn't follow a typical pattern, okay? Atypical is the opposite of typical. So atypical development is development that's not typical. It's different in a noticeable way, okay? So you see someone and you're like, that's not normal. It's very obvious, it's very noticeable to you that what they're doing, what they're saying, what they're feeling is not normal, okay? And it's not normal because it kind of deviates or it kind of travels away from what is normally considered usual or appropriate for that particular environment or maybe that particular culture or place. Okay, so that's what atypical development is. Development that is not typical. It's different in a very noticeable way, and it deviates or it travels away from what we would normally define as usual or appropriate. Okay, so sometimes a person showing atypical development might actually act in a very unusual way. They might act in a very inappropriate way. So for example, if we look at the third picture here, this very old man dressed as Sailor Moon, it's a little bit atypical. It's not something you'll usually see. The middle picture here is actually taken from a YouTube video, which I can't show you right now, but it's about a man who believes that he was destined to be a puppy. And so he's married, obviously he's married to his wife, but every day he gets up and he makes her help him wear this puppy costume, and he crawls around on all fours around his house like a little puppy, and he wants to be treated like a puppy. It's a really unusual and different in a noticeable way kind of thing that he's doing. Okay, so those are just some examples of atypical development that we might be able to look at in this slide. So in our next slide, what we're then focused on is defining, okay, what is normal and what is abnormal. So this concept of normality is basically talking about a pattern of thoughts, feelings, and behavior. Because remember, from the start of the year, whenever we talk about psychology, we're talking about mental processes and behavior, yeah? So our mental processes are referring to our thoughts and feelings, and our behavior is basically our outward actions that are obvious to other people. So normality refers to thoughts, feelings, and behavior that conform or that follow a usual, typical, or expected standard. So you can use the memory tip UTE, to remember that normality, or when we consider that something is normal, that thing is usual, that thing is typical, that thing is expected, okay? So there are many different perspectives or approaches by which we might define something as normal, and we're going to go through that later in this slide. Now, on the other hand, abnormality is obviously the opposite of normality. So abnormality is something that's abnormal. It's basically referring to thoughts, feelings, or behavior that are deviant. Deviant means they travel away from what's usual or expected. Distressing, so they can cause either the person themselves or the people around them some kind of stress in a negative way. And dysfunctional, so if you've got thoughts, feelings, or behavior that don't allow you to function normally, that don't allow you to go to work or go to school or to just normally interact with people or function like a normal person in society, that could be a reflection that those thoughts, feelings, and behaviors are abnormal. Okay, so how do we explain normal? So if we look at this picture here, it says normal is an illusion. What is normal to the spider is chaos to the fly. So obviously, depending on who you are, depending on what your perspective is, depending on what environment you're coming from, all of these things can actually define what is normal and what is abnormal. What's normal to do in Melbourne may very well be abnormal to do in some small village in some country, okay? What's normal, vice versa, what's normal in that village might be very abnormal in Melbourne, okay? So again, there are many different definitions or perspectives, or basically approaches that we can use to describe this concept of normality, or what is normal, okay? And in the next few slides, we're going to be looking at those different approaches to describing normality. So when we're talking about the approaches or these concepts relating to the ways that which we can actually view normality or view what is normal and what is abnormal, we can use a memory tip called "Sorry, Sally failed her method SAC." Okay, so these are just kind of the first letters of each of the names of the approaches. So the first one is sociocultural. So the SO in sorry reflects the SO in sociocultural. So sociocultural approach, statistical approach, failed, or the F in failed is for functional approach. Her is H, so historical approach, medical approach, and the S in SAC is again situational approach. So these are the basically 6 different approaches that we can use to basically understand or define normality, or what is normal. So let's go through them now. So the first one is really straightforward. It's basically the sociocultural approach. So the word sociocultural comes from 2 words, society and culture. Okay, so when we're looking at what is normal using a sociocultural approach, we're basically trying to say that a thought, feeling, or behavior can be considered appropriate, acceptable, and usual if that particular society or culture accepts that particular behavior. So we know that in certain parts of the world, like Burma or, you know, some of those mountainous kind of villages, some ladies actually wear these neck rings, okay? And neck rings are actually worn from quite a young age because apparently what they do is they make your neck longer. And so in those particular cultures, having a really long neck or wearing these neck rings isn't seen as something that's suppressive. It's not seen as something that's abnormal. It's actually seen as something that's normal. And most women actually want to wear these gold kind of neck extensions or neck rings because it actually makes their neck longer and it actually makes them apparently look more attractive. Okay, so having a long neck in those cultures might be considered to be normal and might be considered to be attractive. In some cultures, it's very common to wail loudly at a funeral. So when you go to a funeral, it's really loud and everyone is crying and no one is trying to stop themselves from crying. Everyone is crying, okay? And some cultures even hire like professional wailers, which is basically a professional that you hire to cry at someone's funeral, okay? It's really weird, but to us, it might not seem that normal, okay? Because obviously a lot of what we see in funerals in TV or maybe funerals you've gone to, people maybe don't wail that loudly. Maybe people are just quiet, paying their respects, or they're crying quietly. But in some cultures, that might actually be seen as normal and acceptable, okay? Whereas in other cultures, like we know with, when you think about like a white person's funeral, everyone's just quiet, kind of paying their respects, okay? So what is normal and what is abnormal, again, depends on culture. So the next approach to normality that we're looking at is called the statistical approach. Now, the statistical approach is basically talking about the fact that if we are to draw a graph or draw up a normal distribution of people, the point right in the middle here, that point there, or that kind of peak, is actually the normal, kind of the mean level or the mean average kind of indication. Okay, whatever you see on the two opposite sides are kind of your extremities. Okay, they're basically your extremities. So the very rare things that happen. And what's in the middle is basically kind of still common. So what we're trying to say here is that if a large majority of people show a certain thought, feeling, or behavior, then that particular behavior might be considered to be normal. Okay, so it's normal to laugh when you're being tickled. Most people will show this behavioral response. Okay. However, it's abnormal to laugh at a funeral, okay? This is a very rare behavior. And if I were to graph on a normal distribution, the number of people who actually laugh at a funeral, I would be kind of going towards these extremities. Very, very rare. Unless you've got some kind of probably mental issue or mental disorder, no one's going to laugh at a funeral. That's just completely bizarre, okay? But most people will laugh when being tickled. So that would come in the middle here, where there's the majority majority of the population being represented, okay? So the statistical approach just uses this idea of percentages. It just uses this idea of average, below average, above average kind of concepts to understand the normality or how normal a certain thought, feeling, or behavior is. Okay, the next one is the functional approach. So the functional approach is looking at this idea that thoughts, feelings, and behaviors are considered normal if the individual is able to cope with living independently, and if the thought, feeling, or behavior allows them to function like an effective person in society. So obviously, if you're able to, take a shower by yourself, if you're able to dress yourself, if you're able to make a meal for yourself and make friends, all of that stuff is normal because it helps you to function as a member of society. However, if you're just lying in bed all day, if you're not eating properly, if you're avoiding everyone and not talking to anyone, that could be seen as abnormal behavior, because according to the functional approach, these behaviors are not allowing you to function as an effective member of society. Okay, so that's basically what we talk about when we say the functional approach. That if a behavior or thought or feeling allows you to live properly and function properly, then it's normal. If a thought, feeling, or behavior doesn't allow you to function effectively or to live properly and independently, then that would be considered abnormal. The historical approach is basically talking about this idea that at some point in history or at some point or period in time or era, certain behaviors, thoughts, or feelings might have been considered abnormal or might have been considered normal, but in a different period of time or a different historical period, those behaviors would start to become seen as abnormal, okay, or not typical. So one example we can talk about is like parenting disciplining techniques. And even if you talk about like, even talking about things like student disciplining techniques. So, obviously back in the olden days, like ages ago, smacking a child would be seen as a legitimate disciplining technique. So you take a child, you smack them. But today, if you were to smack a child, you would probably be seen as an abuser. That child will probably say something, oh my God, I'm gonna report you to child services or something like that. Because today, smacking a child or, giving that kind of punishment is not normal. It's not typical, and it's not something that's usual anymore, okay? Obviously, another example is like, children at school. So a lot of your parents might tell you, or grandparents might tell you that when they were at school, it was probably quite normal for a child to kind of come to the front of the class and the teacher might smack their hand with a ruler, or the teacher might scream at them in a very kind of abusive way if they did something wrong. Okay. Nowadays, luckily for everyone, you know, it's like you can't do that anymore, okay? That's not something that's on, that's not something that's acceptable or normal anymore. So again, the normality or how normal we define a thought, feeling, or behavior depends on which era or period of time we make that judgment, okay? Back in the 1900s or 1800s, a lot of women would wear corsets, like permanently. They'd wear like these really constricting, I'm pretty sure you guys have probably heard of them. They'd wear these very constricting kind of things that would make their waist very small. And they'd wear that for like 12, 13, 14 hours at a time. And every woman at that period of time was doing that at that point in history. But today that would be considered abnormal, or that would be considered extreme, because no one does that anymore according to this current historical period. Okay, so that's basically the historical approach. The medical approach is basically using this idea that there are certain abnormal thoughts, feelings, and behaviors that can actually be associated to having an actual medical condition, okay? So a lot of you might have heard of certain mental disorders like schizophrenia, okay? You might have probably seen it being represented in some TV show or in popular culture, but a lot of you might, when you think of schizophrenia, a lot of you might think of, okay, this person thinks that the government is after them, or they think that aliens are living in their backyard, or they think that someone's after them. So when we're talking about schizophrenia often involves these abnormal thoughts, feelings, and behaviors, okay? The person thinks that a certain government agent is after them. They think that aliens are after them. And so that's quite abnormal, but then there's a medical explanation for why that person is experiencing those thoughts or feelings, okay? Or why they are lashing out and why they're showing that kind of behavior. So medical approach suggests that a person isn't just showing abnormal behavior, but there's some medical underlying biological reason or cause as to why they're showing that behavior. And that biological cause doesn't just have to stay there, but it can actually become diagnosed, and the person or the patient can actually get some kind of treatment for that as well. Okay, so obviously if someone's experiencing hallucinations or they think they're being spied on, they might have schizophrenia. So like I said before, this is basically analyzing abnormal behavior using the medical approach. The situational approach is basically dealing with this idea that certain thoughts, feelings, and behaviors might be considered normal for one setting or situation, but might be considered abnormal for another setting or situation. So if you look at this picture here, these are basically kids who thought it would be a good idea to come to school in pajamas, okay? So that is basically considered abnormal for this situation, because normally you don't turn up to school in pajamas, okay? Normally you turn up to school in your school uniform or whatever. So for this particular situation, wearing pajamas to school is considered abnormal, but wearing pajamas when you're at home or when it's close to bedtime is normal, okay? So according to the situation, that thought, feeling, or behavior might be considered normal or abnormal. It depends on the actual context or the situation or the setting that you're in, okay? In the same way that, you know, going to sleep in class is abnormal or should be considered abnormal, but going to sleep at home when it's nearly bedtime could be considered normal, okay? So it depends on the situation. Cool. Okay, yeah, so we're done with approaches for normality now. So just following on from that, we're going to now look at this concept of typical and atypical behaviors. So basically, when we're talking about behavior, we can either define it into something typical, which is something that a person or people would usually or normally do, which is basically a standard, or we can divide behaviors into being atypical. Okay, atypical means they're not usual, they're not typical, they're not standard, and in other words, they are kind of what you wouldn't expect. Okay, they don't follow the expected standard there. So this is this concept of typical and atypical behaviors, and obviously there are many examples of this, but I thought I would put in the one with Katie in Mean Girls. So you'd realize that at the beginning of Mean Girls, Katie's quite a nice girl. She's really friendly, really kind to people. And so people kind of accept that that's the usual behavior for Katie to act in, that she's normally kind, she's normally friendly, she's normally down to earth. But when she starts to hang out with the plastics, and then she starts to become a little bit mean, become a little bit more insulting to others, you know, her other friends who she originally kind of started hung out with, they're like, oh my God, this is not you. This is not who you are. Why are you being like this? So for them, seeing her like that was atypical, okay? Her being mean was atypical because that wasn't the usual behavior or the typical behavior that she had originally shown. Okay, so typical and atypical behaviors are important for us, especially because a lot of this chapter and a lot of what you're going to be doing for your project is based around mental health. Okay, so in mental health, it's important for us to be able to judge whether this person's behavior is the usual or whether it's unusual. So if you're normally like a really happy person, really good with everyone, and suddenly you become really withdrawn, suddenly you don't want to leave the house, suddenly you don't want to see your friends, that could actually be a really good example for a psychologist or for a doctor to say, okay, something is actually going wrong with this person, because normally they're really happy to hang out with their friends and that's the typical behavior. But right now they're in some mental state where they don't want to hang out with their friends, and that's not typical, that's atypical of them. Okay, so atypical behaviors are very important for us to analyze because they can actually tell us whether a person is on the way to getting some kind of mental health issue or mental disorder. Okay, then we're talking about adaptive behavior. So adaptive behavior is this other concept that's related to mental health and mental health issues. Adaptive behavior is when you show behavior that allows you to adapt, to adjust, or to basically familiarize with yourself with the environment in an effective and appropriate way. So basically when we're talking about any kind of behavior that allows you to function, okay? So the adaptive behavior is very similar to this idea of the functional approach to normality. So adaptive behavior is any behavior that allows you to adjust effectively and appropriately to your environment. So going to school, going to work, speaking to other people, interacting with other people, all of this stuff is adaptive and it's positive because it's allowing you to get used to your environment. So let's say that you move to a new town or a new suburb, you've got to go to a new school. If you're just going to be at school all day sitting in a corner, not trying to make any friends, not trying to get to know anyone, your behavior is not adaptive. In fact, your behavior is maladaptive because you're not trying to adjust to your environment in an appropriate and effective way. Okay? People who show higher levels of adaptive behavior are also more likely to have better mental health. Okay? And in contrast to that, people who show maladaptive behavior are more likely to develop a mental health issue or mental disorder. So remember, M for maladaptive, M for mental disorder, okay? You'll realize that when a person does develop a mental disorder like depression, they actually show more signs of maladaptive behavior. So they don't want to leave their room, they don't want to go to school, they don't want to go to work, and they don't want to speak to anyone. And these are all examples of things that don't allow them to adjust to their environment in an effective and appropriate way. So we can apply maladaptive behavior to anyone. It doesn't have to be someone who's got a mental disorder. So if you've got a little brother or a little sister who always throws tantrums every single time for the most stupidest or the most silly reasons, that child might be showing maladaptive behavior, okay? Maladaptive behavior, again, is anything that stops you from being able to adjust to your environment. So let's say the family wants to go out for a nice dinner and there's no reason why the child should be distressed or annoyed about this, but they just start throwing a tantrum for no reason at all. That is an example of maladaptive behavior, okay? Or if you've got OCD or someone's got OCD, someone who's washing their hands endlessly for hours, just keep washing their hands because they feel like their hands are never clean enough. That is also an example of maladaptive behavior because that behavior doesn't allow them to adjust to their environment and to get on with their day and to function like a normal person, okay? Most mental disorders, but especially some mental disorders, like for example, eating disorders, are also examples of maladaptive behavior because they don't allow a person to eat properly or to have a proper kind of normal eating pattern, okay? And that's obviously not going to allow them to live a normal life. So any behavior that doesn't allow you to live a normal life is an example of a maladaptive behavior. Remember, the word adapt means that you're adjusting and you're adapting. So maladaptive is the opposite of adjusting and adapting to your environment. Okay, we're almost done. So just before we finish, I just want to go through 3 definitions. And those definitions are mental health problem, and mental disorder, okay? The mental health definition, if you do Health and Human, it's the same mental health definition that we use in Health and Human. It's basically talking about this concept that mental health is a state of well-being, and we use this memory tip. I don't know how many of you will use it, but it's just a memory tip we used to use with the year 12s. Obviously, I've just taken this slide from the year 12 PowerPoint. But it's just a memory tip that we use so the kids will remember what are the different components that I need to include in that definition. So it's called WASTER. So W for well-being, A for acknowledges your abilities, S for stress coping or how you cope with stress, T for thinking clearly and rationally or in a reasonable way, E for expressing your emotions, and R for resilience. Okay, so resilience is something you might have come across when we did Health and Human as well, for those of you who do HHD. Okay, so putting all of this stuff together from our memory tip, mental health is a state of well-being in which a person acknowledges their abilities, has effective coping mechanisms for stress, can think clearly and rationally, can express emotions, and can display resilience. It doesn't have to be word to word, but as long as you're including these 6 kind of elements here that are mentioned in this memory tip WASTER, those are the main things that you need to include. Okay, so it's about emotions. It's also about the way you think. It's about the way you deal with stress. And whenever we think about mental health, we think about self-esteem, right? And self-esteem is about acknowledging your abilities. So it's important that you mention those different components there. That's what mental health is about. And remember that mental health is not just about thinking, it's about other stuff as well. So you do need to include all of these elements there to actually get full marks for that particular definition. Obviously, I'm not expecting you to know the exact order or know this in like word to word accuracy. But yeah, as long as the main things are there, it doesn't matter which order you put them in or how you phrase them, the main key terms have to be there, okay? The next thing we're looking at is mental health problem. So mental health problem is not actually like a mental disorder. It's not really about having schizophrenia. It's not really about having depression, but it's about this concept that at some point or the other, every single person is going to go through some kind of mental health problem, okay? Mental health problems don't just come out of the blue. They happen because of some kind of stressor in your life. So the passing of a friend, you know, this threat that you might be failing the year level, kind of like having issues at work, having issues at school, having issues with family members or with friends. A mental health problem is usually less severe and of a shorter duration than a mental disorder. And what it usually includes is stress and anxiety. So a person with a mental health problem doesn't have a full-blown mental disorder just yet, but they're just experiencing a lot of stress and a lot of anxiety. And this could be affecting their ability to kind of function normally, okay? So mental health problems are different though than mental disorders because number one, mental health problems do get better with time, or as soon as the stressor passes, that mental health problem is gone. So let's say you were scared you were going to fail year 10 or year 9 or whatever. As soon as you realize that, yes, I've passed year 9 or yes, I've passed year 10 and everything's all good, that mental health problem or that stress and anxiety will dissipate or will basically go away. Mental health problems don't lead to the level of dysfunction that a mental disorder would normally cause. So even if you've got a mental health problem, you are not tied up in bed all day, you're still going to school, you're still going to work, you're still kind of interacting with your family and friends, you're not shutting yourself off from the world completely, okay, which is what normally happens with people who have mental disorders. Mental health problems can also include other emotions other than basically mental states like stress and anxiety. So they can also include emotions like sadness and despair as well. And a lot of the time we're talking about mental health problems as involving these emotions because like I said, mental health problems can often occur as a result of some kind of life stressors. So if your grandparents or if someone close to you has passed away, that will automatically come with a lot of sadness and despair, okay? And so a lot of the time mental health problems include these emotions because a lot of hardships that people go in through life cause them to feel these negative emotions, okay? But it doesn't mean that they're going to feel these emotions forever because like I said, mental health problems are not permanent, they're temporary. And as soon as the stressor or as soon as that hardship or difficult situation goes away, the mental health problem goes away as well. In contrast to a mental health problem is a mental disorder. Now, mental disorders are more permanent, they are more intense than mental health problems. And it's important to remember that if you've got a mental health problem and it's not going away and it's consistently there, maybe because the stressor or that hardship or that difficult situation is still there, that can often turn into a mental disorder. And I'll give you an example of that. So if someone is, for example, in a relationship and they're experiencing, from the time they got married or from the time they had kids, they're experiencing domestic abuse in the household, but they can't just, for example, get divorced, or they can't just run away from their family. That person is constantly experiencing this stress and this anxiety. And what started off as a mental health problem for them because of the domestic violence can actually turn into a mental disorder like depression or like some kind of anxiety disorder. Okay, so it's important to remember that before someone develops a mental disorder, they're usually experiencing a mental health problem for some time, okay? And that is often how these things progress, okay? A person just doesn't wake up with a mental disorder one fine day. It does come up as a result of previous mental health problem that wasn't resolved or that wasn't able to be fixed. So let's look at the key components, or what are the key terms you're expected to know in the definition of mental disorder. Firstly, you need to know that, and we use this memory tip iPads to remember what the mental disorder definition should include. Now remember, mental disorder and mental health are actually these three definitions we've been going through so far are required next year for year 12, okay? So if you are doing this subject in Unit 4 or the second half of Unit 4, you will be asked about these definitions again. So making sure that we understand what's required of us from this year itself, okay? So we use the memory tip iPads to remember what mental disorders include, okay? So I for impairment, okay? You've got some kind of impairment in functioning independently. You've got psychological dysfunction, which means there's some kind of issue or there's some kind of lack of ability to think or feel normally, okay, or as a normal person would. You've got atypical and abnormal thoughts, feelings, and behavior. You've got distress. So distress is like a negative form of stress. And you've got socially or culturally inappropriate thoughts, feelings, and behavior. So basically, thoughts, feelings, and behaviors that are not considered normal for your society or for the culture that you live in, okay? Now, obviously, another word for mental disorder, if you look at this picture here, is mental illness. So if you come across this word in your textbook or in a Adrolo video or some other resource online, mental illness and mental disorder are actually the same kind of term. They're just used interchangeably, okay? But they mean the exact same thing. So just tying these components together now. So mental disorder is a state of impairment in which a person cannot function independently. They experience psychological dysfunction, distress, and they display atypical and abnormal thoughts, feelings, and behaviors which are not appropriate for their society or for their culture that they live in. So that's all you got to do. It doesn't matter what order you put these words in. It doesn't matter if the socially, culturally inappropriate part goes first and psychological dysfunction moves to the bottom. It doesn't matter as long as you're including those 5 key terms there, okay? And you can use that mnemonic to remember them. So that's basically all we covered for today. So does anybody have any questions? You can either speak up or you can put it in the chat box, whatever's comfortable for you.
Did we do 6.1 and 6.2 today or just 6.1?
So basically with your questions, we've actually done all the content to cover up to 6.3. I don't know how it's numbered in your book, but yeah, we've basically done up to, I think, 6.3.
Okay.
Yeah. So basically just if you're going to be reading from the textbook, you're going to be reading everything up to mental disorder. So just stop when you come to biopsychosocial framework. We'll be doing this next. Okay.
Okay.
So basically, I just wanted, before you guys go, I just wanted to, sorry, just one second. Okay, I just wanted to bring your attention to this slide now. Basically, just so you have a clear idea of what we really need to be doing for this week, okay? What's your work? So if you look, and I don't know how many of you know how to access this, so I'm just trying to confirm and let you know. When you go to your class page, I'm pretty sure all of you can see the 3 tiles that say week 1 tasks, week 2 tasks, week 3 tasks. So whenever you're unsure of what you need to do, all you need to do is you need to think of what week you're in. So now we're in week 2. Click this particular thing. And when you click this particular tile with the kittens or whatever on it, that says week 2 tasks, it's going to open up a page that looks like this. And it will usually say by the end of week 2, you're expected to have completed the following task. So today was our first online session. So today all we did was review the chapter 6 PowerPoint. I've given you this recording or this lecture. This lecture obviously has been recorded and I will paste this up on the drive. Now, I just want to make sure that everyone knows how to access that drive.
Yeah, miss, it's working.
It's working, yeah? I posted a link to that on the files. It should say link to psychology recording drive or whatever. You open up that Word document, there's a link in there. You put that in your Google Chrome or your web browser and it will take you directly to the recordings, okay? And you can just click on it and download it from there. So first online session, we've already done the first thing. The second thing you're going to do now, or whenever you get time, is to just watch the animated clip below on depression. Now, we know that depression is an example of a mental disorder. So I want you to just go into this tile that says week 2 tasks, and there's a little cartoonish kind of animated video called What is Depression? I want you to just watch that. It's just a few minutes long so that you get a better idea of what a mental disorder is, okay? Now, in the second online session, which is tomorrow, is it tomorrow? I get confused between the different subjects. I think it's tomorrow. Thursday. Okay, yeah. Our second online session, which is on Thursday then, we will have a little Zoom session. It'll just be like maybe 15, 20 minutes, just so I can ask you guys if you have any questions or you can ask me any questions. And after that, I'm going to leave you to your own devices and we'll all move into the Schoolbox class page and you're going to start working on your learning activities. So I'll still be online, but then you can still ask me questions through the social stream at that point. I have pasted up the chapter 6 homework questions checklist on the Schoolbox files, so you can download that from there. Now the questions that you need to do for this week only are pasted here and are pasted in the week 2 tasks tile. In the third online session, if you move into week 2 tasks under the files, you'll see that I've attached a worksheet that says worksheet comparing mental health problem and disorder. This worksheet is going to test your knowledge of the last 3 slides that we looked at and those definitions. And it's a really easy one. You're just basically writing up the definitions and giving an example of each. And I can help you with that if you're struggling. So the main 2 things I need you guys to submit by the end of this week are the worksheet that you can find in week 2 tasks and learning activity 6.1 and 6.3, which you can start with at any point when you're free, or you can start them from the next online session on Thursday, okay? So just making sure that we are submitting all that work. And all the work that I required last week, you need to go into week 1 tasks and submit that to me. So I'm only going to give you the rest of this week to do that. If you do not do that, I'm not going to be accepting the work after this week, okay? We need to be up to date. So that's all for today. It's 10:40. So thanks for attending the Zoom session. I will download the recording and upload that to the drive. And I will see you guys on Thursday, inshallah. So have a nice day and I will see you then. Bye.
Bye, miss.
Bye.
Bye-bye.